My name is Bianca Anderson, and I'll be presenting my Year 2 research project entitled Educators' Professional Development Opportunities and the Inclusion of Black Students with Autism Spectrum Disorder in the General Classroom. With the growing diversity in Ontario schools, the Ministry of Education has mandated many policies to cultivate a more inclusive and equitable education experience for all learners. However, many students with exceptionalities are still disproportionately excluded from participating in general classroom instruction, while the majority of students with autism are now being educated in regular classroom, inclusive classroom environments amongst their neurotypical peers. The Ministry of Education mandates ongoing evidence-based professional development opportunities for educators to ensure the appropriate implementation of CRRP and ABA to promote inclusive practices. However, African American children are still documented as being overrepresented in behavioral and special education classrooms and underrepresented in their diagnosis for ASD. There are many strategies that can be employed to support an educator's ability to cultivate an inclusive classroom environment for both racialized students and students with ASD. However, students' racial and special needs identities are often regarded separately and singularly, and therefore do not inform intergroup differences in true lived experiences. There is a need to examine the intersectionality of race and exceptionality in both PDOs and how current professional development opportunities support educators' ability to provide an equitable and inclusive educational experience for Black students with ASD. The purpose of this study was to understand how elementary school general classroom educators in Ontario are supported by professional development opportunities to best serve and advocate for Afro-Canadian students with ASD in an inclusive classroom. I created 3 subsidiary questions that supported my main research question, which was, in what ways have professional development opportunities supported general classroom educators' ability to create an equitable and inclusive classroom environment for Black students with ASD? The traditional medical model of ASD is often defined from a deficit perspective, hyper-focusing on the limitations of symptomologies rather than their strength. The DSM-V defines ASD as a neurodevelopmental disorder characterized by deficits in social interaction, emotional regulation, communication, perseverance of interfering, restrictive, repetitive behaviors. While the medical model of ASD is widely accepted, the promotion of this model can restrict individuals with ASD from building identities outside of their perceived impairments, participating in social activities, and in academic spaces. Inclusion is defined as an educational experience in the regular classroom in which pupils' racial, social, and cultural identities, as well as their academic needs, are accepted, respected, supported, and reflected in their educational environments. Provincial placement policies suggest that, in most cases, accommodations for the inclusion of students with exceptionalities in the general classroom should be made prior to considering their placement into special education classrooms. Students with exceptionalities that partake in effective inclusive classroom instructions have shown marked improvements in academic skill, higher levels of social engagement, and better qualities of friendship. Previous research demonstrates that general classroom teachers report having limited knowledge on autism, lack the confidence in their ability to support students with ASD, and report low self-efficacy. And in order to rectify and improve educators' ability to create effective and inclusive classroom environments and support student learning, high quality and sustained professional development opportunities are employed. Previous research demonstrates that engaging in professional development opportunities that attend to the inclusivity of students with exceptionalities like ASD in the general classroom have been linked to the restructuring and dismantling of systemic ableism ideologies, improvements in self-efficacy reporting, increased confidence level and ability to support students with ASD, increased competency level on ASD, and improvements in implementing effective research-based teaching strategies. Reichhoff et al. In 2020 engaged pre- and in-service teachers in CRP and empathy-focused PDOs. By participating in seminars, webinars, and self-reflective practice, educators develop a greater understanding and capacity for authentic empathy towards diverse students, and developed a greater awareness of the type of learning materials necessary for the inclusion of their racialized students. Furthermore, Wilder et al. In 2004 forecast a need for teachers to simultaneously account for the multicultural identities of their students with autism that live and operate in Eurocentric dominant culture systems in order to provide an equitable and inclusive education for students from multicultural backgrounds. I conducted 2 semi-structured remote interviews that lasted between 45 to 60 minutes. I gave participants the pseudonyms SS and LL to maintain their confidentiality. Each participant had to have the following criteria. They must be an elementary school teacher, they should hold an Ontario teaching certificate, have a minimum of 2 years teaching experience, have worked in an Ontario school board, and has previous experience working with an Afro-Canadian student with ASD and has participated in ABA and CRP PDOs. All interviews were audio recorded and then transcribed on Microsoft Word. Transcripts were coded using descriptive coding systems, categorized, which allowed for the development of basic and organizing themes, which will then be discussed in later sections. I identify as an Afro-Canadian from a Caribbean background. I have several years of experience as a behavioral therapist with children and young adults from various cultural backgrounds that have been diagnosed with ASD. I place a considerable amount of importance on the need for society, but more specifically educators, to come from a place of more understanding, empathy, and advocacy for Afro-Canadian children with ASD in and outside of school systems. My experience has taught me to be mindful and caution against the overgeneralization of Eurocentric values and ideologies in and outside of educational settings, and the need to uphold the identities of diverse bodies I have the privilege of working with and learning from. For the first theme, participants selected for the study believed that engaging in CRRP PDOs, they were able to develop an awareness of the cultural perspectives and barriers Black students with ASD encounter, and has informed their ability to create culturally relevant and representative ABA resources. The second theme suggests that educators express a need to dismantle barriers to access formal and informal elective PDOs, and express a strong desire to learn more about their students' experiences and identities through conversations with parents and in-school support staff to create a more equitable and inclusive classroom environment. In spite of the fact that students' specific exceptionality was not discussed in tandem with their racial identity during professional development opportunities, educators were still able to shift their overall perspective and develop a more acute awareness of students' identity and lived experiences. Participant SS shares that by engaging in self-reflective practice through school book clubs, she was able to see how heavy the battle was for her Black students with ASD and how they have not created equitable environments for them. Participant LL was enlightened by the importance of engaging in anti-racism PDOs like Learn, Disrupt, Rebuild as a means to develop her capacity to empathize with her racialized students with exceptionalities. These excerpts demonstrate educators' improved awareness of the barriers Black students with ASD encounter, resulting in a different lived experience relative to their peers, the exclusion of their identity in classroom environment considerations, and the importance of developing a greater capacity to empathize with Black students with ASD in the general classroom. These findings are echoed by Reckhoff et al. In 2020, who demonstrates that training in CERP and social justice have helped educators develop an increased capacity for authentic empathy towards their racialized students, has encouraged educators to embrace and acknowledge the perspectives of their racialized students into classroom environments, lesson planning considerations, and therefore has informed their ability to include the racialized students in a more meaningful way. Educators in my study have engaged in both formal and informal PDOs and ABA that have informed their ability to create culturally relevant ABA teaching resources, which have helped them create a more inclusive learning environment for Black students with ASD. Participant SS highlights that the Toronto District School Board offered a PDO that challenged educators to think about why Black students are disproportionately placed on IEPs. SS states that through these challenges, she was able to consider the types of pictures she uses for PECs, ensuring that they were culturally sensitive and reflective of her student's identity. SS states that in her experience, formal PDOs and ABA offered by the Toronto District School Board typically do not directly address the needs and or identities of Black students with ASD, and therefore presents limitations on her ability to create appropriate resources. However, in-school support personnel like the special needs assistant have been invaluable in their contributions to informing her practice to create inclusive classrooms. Similarly, participant SLL found that consulting the in-school supports team like the ANDS team helped to consider and create culturally diverse communication systems for Black students with ASD. This data set suggests that formal ABA PDOs do not directly address the intersectionality of race and ability in such a way that directly supports the educator's ability to create the necessary resources for their culturally diverse students with ASD. Instead, teachers are presented with scenarios and challenges during formal ABA PDOs that encourage the educator to consider the perspectives and identities of their students. Conversely, in-school support teams appear to provide the educator with direct assistance and coaching, demonstrating how teachers can create learning materials that are representative of their students' abilities and racial identity. These findings are echoed by Darling Hammond et al. In 2017, who suggests that effective PDOs must incorporate evidence-based practices, opportunities for active learning, provide coaching, expert feedback, and self-reflection. And Reckhoff et al. In 2020 further reiterates that PDOs that consider CRRP is effective in helping educators set their own personal Eurocentric viewpoints aside while creating learning materials for their racialized students. Both educators that I interviewed for my study discussed their feelings of frustration and desire to access ABA and CERP PDOs offered by their respective boards. Participant LL expressed that she tries her best to create inclusive classroom environments for her students to support varying abilities, however, often feels overwhelmed when the necessary supports are not readily available. Upon agreeing to participate in my study, she consulted a friend about ABA and CERP PDOs offered by her school board, and she realized that there are actually learning opportunities available. However, there is a lack of communication or communication breakdown that interferes with her ability to access PDOs. Participant SS shares that her transition into an intensive support a special education classroom has improved her awareness and therefore access to courses offered by the school board and Geneva Center, but she believes that she doesn't think she would have the same awareness of the available PDOs as a regular classroom teacher. Both participants expressed in-school support staff are invaluable in supporting their ability to create inclusive classroom environments. However, support staff are not readily available to support educators as a result of burnout, quitting, transitioning, and/or poor coordination and timing. These findings are mirrored by Nylar in 2002, who suggests special education support teams are often stressed, overworked, and often inaccessible to classroom teachers as a result of extreme workload due to limited support from their districts. Educators have previously expressed the need for more guided in-field experiences with special education teachers in order to meet the diverse needs of students with ASD. If the in-school support staff are not readily available to support the classroom teacher with the necessary information to develop inclusive academic spaces, then formal PDOs in ABA and CERP need to incorporate similar hands-on coaching type techniques that inform educators' ability to create an equitable and inclusive classroom environment for Black students with ASD. Educators in my study expressed a desire to incorporate informed conversations with parents and in-school support teams in order to support their ability to create inclusive classrooms for Black students with ASD. Participant SS suggests the helpful application of having conversations with Black students' parents. She believes that engaging parents in conversation would be helpful to understand the individualized cultural and racial perspective of her students. She then addresses the need to have conversations in the broader community about administering the appropriate behavioral targets in relation to her students' cultural perspective. Participant LL has learned a lot from in-school support teams like the ANS team about how to create culturally relevant ABA resources, however believes necessary improvements in the delivery of PDOs would further help inform her ability to support Black students with ASD. She suggests that the racial identity should be addressed head-on when meeting with support teams to best support her students. These findings suggest that there is a visible gap in the delivery of information in the current PDOs in ABA and CERP that do not thoroughly account for the cultural perspectives of Black students with ASD to allow for their full inclusion in the general classroom. These findings are echoed by Hill and Sessoms Penny in 2000, who suggests PDOs often fail to address the non-specificity of ABA resources and the multifaceted nature of inclusion. Wilder et al. In 2014 suggests that educators should be aware of the differing value systems and expectations of multicultural family units as they may differ from the Eurocentric value systems. Abel et al. In 2015 showcases educators' reoccurring desire to learn about the individualized needs of their students as well as the necessary strategies to support students with ASD. Lalvani in 2015 demonstrates shifts in educators' perspective through discussion and reflection that encourages educators to rethink and consider the positions of power embedded in education systems in relation to how they define and set expectations for their students with exceptionalities. By having conversations with helpful support systems like parents and in-school support teams, educators may gain a better understanding of how the specific cultural perspectives and value systems of Black students with ASD in their classrooms and thereby create a more holistic and inclusive classroom environment. While current professional development opportunities in ABA and CERP directly and indirectly support educators' ability to create an inclusive classroom environment for Black students with ASD, teachers report barriers to access current PDOs and support personnel. While there is a push by school boards towards creating a more inclusive and educational spaces to support diverse student population, there is a need to restructure the delivery of current PDOs and to consider the amalgamation of the multiple identities one student may hold to best support teachers' pedagogical practice and student development. The current study has limitations as a result of the small sample size, as well as the absent perspectives of both Black students with ASD and their parental guardians.
This can serve to be an issue as their experiences may not align with the classroom educators who I decided to highlight in this particular research study. For future research, I believe the focus should be on the perspectives of Black students of children with ASD to gain a better understanding of how educators can better support students in an inclusive classroom environment.